million in medical bills. The best audiologists, from Johns Hopkins to Geneva, all of them baffled. Oliver Hart had the kind of wealth, the kind that could buy islands, influence elections, and bury scandals. But there was one thing his money couldn't buy. Not even once. A single sound. From his 8-year-old son, Shea. The boy lived inside a world of absolute silence, suffocating silence. The experts called it congenital deafness. They said the nerves were dead. They told Oliver to give up, to stop dragging the kid, from office to office, to specialists who charged $5,000 an hour, just to shake their heads. But the doctors were wrong. The answer wasn't in a neurological scan, and it wasn't in a Swiss clinic. The answer was hiding in a shadow. A shadow the billionaire father was too grief-stricken to see. And it would take a maid, 27 years old, 0 medical training, a woman barely scraping by on minimum wage, to find what the Nobel Prize winners missed. But by the time she saw it, she would have to choose. Break the strictest rule of the Hart estate, or let the boy die in silence. And if you want to understand the miracle, you have to understand the curse. First, the Hart estate sat on 40 acres of prime Connecticut coastline, a sprawling Georgian manor, the kind that looked like it belonged on a postcard for the American dream. The lawns were manicured to the millimeter. The marble columns gleamed white against a blue sky. But the locals in Greenwich didn't look at the Hart mansion with envy. They looked at it with pity, because they knew. Inside those walls, time had stopped 8 years ago. Inside, the house was a mausoleum. And the silence wasn't peaceful. The house was heavy with silence. It felt pressurized, like the air inside a submarine, diving too deep. The staff moved through the corridors like ghosts. No shoes on the hardwood, no music, no casual conversation. If a dish clattered in the kitchen, they flinched, terrified the sound would travel. Up the grand staircase, to the master study. That's where Oliver Hart spent his nights. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, nursing a tumbler of aged scotch, staring up at the oil painting, above the limestone fireplace. It was the only color left in his life. The portrait showed Catherine, his wife, beautiful, vibrant, her hand resting protectively on a very pregnant belly. Next to her, a younger Oliver, his face unlined, his eyes full of hope. He stared at that painting and saw the exact moment his life shattered. Catherine died on the delivery table. Complications, the doctors said, massive hemorrhaging. Oliver held her hand as the monitors flatlined, begging her to stay, bargaining with God, offering every cent in his accounts. It didn't work. She slipped away, leaving him with a newborn son he couldn't even look at without weeping. Guilt is a powerful architect. It builds prisons better than any contractor. Oliver built his prison around Shea. He convinced himself that because he couldn't save Catherine, he had to be perfect for the boy. Then he realized something. Shea wasn't responding to lullabies. Shea wasn't turning his head when a door slammed, and the guilt morphed into obsession. "It's my fault," he would whisper to the empty room, the scotch burning his throat. "I wasn't paying attention. I missed something." He attacked the deafness like a hostile corporate takeover. He flew in specialists from Tokyo. He tried experimental surgeries. He bought the most advanced hearing aids on the market, devices that cost more than a luxury sedan. Nothing worked. Shea remained in his silent bubble, quiet, solemn, a child with big dark eyes. That seemed to see too much. And then there was the ticking, the habit. Since he was a toddler, Shea would reach up and touch his right ear, constantly. He'd rub the lobe, tug at the cartilage, sometimes dig a finger in deep, like he was trying to scratch an itch inside his brain. "Stop that," Oliver would snap, pulling the boy's hand away. "Don't fidget." The doctors dismissed it. Self-soothing behavior, they called it. A tic, a coping mechanism, for a deaf child trying to feel something. Oliver hated it. It was a visual reminder of the defect, a constant signal that his son was broken. He didn't know the truth. The boy wasn't soothing himself. He was signaling for help. By October, Oliver had exhausted the list of reputable specialists, and the hopelessness had turned him cold. He fired staff for minor infractions. A wrinkled shirt, a loud footstep, a cough during dinner. The turnover rate at the Hart Manor was legendary. Agencies stopped sending their best people. They started sending whoever was desperate enough to take the job. That's how Victoria Deer ended up. At the front gate, Victoria was 27, smart as a whip, but life had dealt her a bad hand. Her father was gone. Her mother was out of the picture. and her grandmother, the woman who raised her, was fading fast in a nursing home that cost $3,000 a month. Victoria was 3 months behind on payments. The facility director gave her a deadline: pay the balance by Friday, or grandma gets transferred to a state ward. She needed this job. She needed the hazard pay. That came with working for the Mad King of Greenwich. She arrived on a Tuesday morning. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, threatening rain. The iron gates swung open. Victoria drove her rusted sedan up the long, winding driveway, gravel crunching loudly under her tires. She parked around the back, took a deep breath, smoothed her uniform. "Keep your head down," she whispered to herself. "Do the work. Get the check. Don't ask questions." The house manager met her at the service entrance. A severe woman named Mrs. Higgins. She didn't offer a handshake. She offered a warning. "Mr. Hart values privacy and silence above all else," Higgins said, her voice clipped. "You clean the East Wing from 9 to 11. You do not enter the master study. You do not speak to Mr. Hart unless spoken to. And under no circumstances do you interact with the boy." Victoria nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Understood. Good. Here is your bucket. Start in the upstairs nursery." "And Victoria?" Victoria paused. At the foot of the servants' stairs. "If I hear you," Higgins said, her eyes narrowing, "you're fired before you hit the floor." Victoria moved up the stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence, it was the smell. Beneath lemon polish and beeswax, there was something stale, the smell of a place where people stopped living a long time ago. She reached the second-floor landing and opened the nursery door. It was a massive room, filled with expensive toys that looked like they'd never been touched. And there, in the center of the rug, was Shea, smaller than she expected, fragile. He didn't look up. When the door latch clicked, he just stared at a patch of sunlight on the floor, his expression totally blank. Victoria remembered the rules. Do not interact. She gripped her mop, planning to work around him. Then the boy moved. His hand shot up to his right ear. He didn't just rub it, he clawed at it. His face twisted in a sudden, violent grimace of pain, then vanished. As fast as it appeared, he dug his pinky finger into the canal, twisting it, his shoulders hunching, up to his ears. Victoria froze. She'd seen self-soothing before in her grandmother's ward. This wasn't soothing, this was desperation. She took one step forward, a floorboard creaked under her weight. For the first time, Shea turned. He looked right at her, and in that split second, Victoria saw something that made the hair on her arms stand up. The boy wasn't looking at her face, he was looking past her, toward the open door, his eyes wide with absolute, primal terror. Victoria spun around, expecting Oliver Hart looming in the doorway. But the hallway was empty. When she turned back, the boy had stopped scratching, perfectly still again. But Victoria noticed something, a tiny dark smear on the collar of his white shirt, fresh blood coming from inside his ear. That bright red smear on Shea's collar wasn't just blood. To Victoria, it looked like a neon sign, screaming for help. She wanted to drop the mop, run down the hall, pound on the double doors of Oliver Hart's study. She wanted to scream that his son was bleeding, that the experts were wrong, that something physical was hurting this boy. But she froze. Her hand tightened around the mop handle until her knuckles turned white. A memory flashed through her mind, sharp and cold as a razor blade. A stack of envelopes on her kitchen table, in Newark. Final notice, past due, and the facility director's voice on the phone, dry, devoid of pity. "You're 3 months behind, Miss Dear. If the balance isn't cleared by the 1st, your grandmother goes to the state ward." The state ward, a warehouse for the forgotten. A place where the elderly were medicated into stupors and left to stare at peeling beige walls. Until they expired. Victoria had promised her grandmother, the woman who took her in when her own parents died in a wreck on I-95, that she would never end up there. Victoria looked at the heavy oak doors of the study. Then she looked back at Shea, who had already turned away, his small hand covering his ear again. If she spoke up now, if she disrupted the peace of the Hart estate over a spot of blood she couldn't explain, Mrs. Higgins would fire her before she could finish the sentence. No job meant no money. No money meant Grandma went to the ward. Victoria swallowed the scream, wiped the sweat from her palms, and went back to work. But the silence in the house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt complicit. Over the next 3 days, Victoria became a spy in a maid's uniform. She cleaned the baseboards in the hallway, moving with slow, rhythmic caution like a predator, her eyes always tracking the boy. She watched how the other staff moved around him. They didn't treat him like a child. They treated him like a piece of expensive, broken furniture. They dusted around him, stepped over his toys, and never, ever made eye contact. Rumors floated through the kitchen during shift changes. The cook, a superstitious woman from the bayou, whispered that the boy was cursed. Mother died birthing him, she'd mutter, chopping onions with unnecessary violence. Took her life, took his hearing. That's a debt, not a disease. Victoria didn't believe in curses. She believed in what she saw, and what she saw was a boy who wasn't just deaf. He was isolated in a way that should be illegal. She watched Oliver Hart walk down the grand staircase in his $3,000 suit, checking his watch. He would pass right by the sunroom, where Shea sat on the floor. Oliver would pause, just for a fraction of a second, look at the back of his son's head, then keep walking. His jaw would clench, a ripple of muscle jumping in his cheek, but he never stopped. He never reached out. Guilt was eating the father alive, so he chose the easier pain, starve the son of affection, rather than face it. By Thursday, the tension in the house was brittle enough to snap. Victoria was dusting the molding outside the sunroom. When she saw Shea again, he was sitting in a patch of afternoon light, surrounded by the pieces of a complex P-51 Mustang model kit. He was struggling, small fingers trembling, trying to snap the plastic wing into the fuselage. But his coordination was off. He pushed too hard. The plastic groaned. His face crumpled, tears welling up in his dark eyes, not from sadness, from pure, unadulterated frustration. He raised his hand to smash the model against the floor. "Wait," Victoria whispered. It was a breach of protocol, a fireable offense. But her body moved. Before her brain could stop it, she stepped into the room, sank to her knees, and gently caught his wrist. Shea flinched violently, his eyes going wide, with that same primal terror from day one. He pulled back, expecting to be scolded, expecting the cold shoulder. Victoria didn't let go, and she didn't look at him with pity. She looked at him with focus. She took the model plane from his hand, aligned the tabs on the wing, applied steady pressure, and snap, it clicked perfectly into place. She held it out to him for 10 seconds. Nobody breathed. Shea stared at the plane, then up at Victoria. The terror in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by confusion. And then, something that hit Victoria like a physical blow. Hope. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, a ghost of a smile. Victoria smiled back, gave a small two-finger wave. Shea hesitated, then mimicked the gesture. That night, on a lumpy mattress in the servants' quarters, Victoria couldn't sleep. She kept seeing that smile. She kept seeing the blood on the collar. Two images, at war in her head. The boy wasn't broken, he was trapped, and he was in pain. The next morning, she left a peace offering on the bottom step of the stairs, a paper crane, folded from a crisp page of her own notebook. When she came back an hour later, the crane was gone. In its place, a scrap of paper, 2 words scrawled, in shaky, uneven block letters. "Thank you." Victoria pressed the note against her chest, closed her eyes as a prayer formed on her lips. "Lord, give me the guts to do what I have to do." Because she knew it, the truce was over. She couldn't just be his friend, she had to be his savior. That afternoon, the house was empty. Oliver was at a board meeting in the city. Mrs. Gins was overseeing a delivery in the cargo bay. The silence was absolute. Victoria found Shea in the library, curled up in a wingback chair, rocking back and forth. He wasn't playing. He was clutching the side of his head, his face buried in the velvet cushion. He was sobbing, but because he couldn't hear himself, the sounds were guttural, ragged gasps that tore at the air. He was in agony. Victoria bolted the library door. She didn't care about the cameras. She didn't care about the nursing home bills. She rushed to the chair and knelt in front of him. "Shea," she said, knowing he couldn't hear, but needing to say it. "Let me see. You have to let me see." She gently pulled his hands away. His face was flushed, wet with tears and sweat. He resisted at first, whimpering, terrified of the pain. But then he saw her, Victoria, the lady with the paper bird, and he went limp. He surrendered. Victoria pulled a small penlight from her apron pocket. She'd brought it from her grandmother's room. She tilted Shea's head to the side. The ear was red, inflamed, hot to the touch. She clicked the light on. "Okay, baby." "Be brave," she whispered. She pulled the earlobe down and back, straightening the canal, and shone the beam into the darkness. She expected infection. She expected a blockage of wax. She expected the damage the doctors talked about. She didn't expect to see something. Looking back at her, deep inside the canal, past the inflammation, something glinted in the light. Black, shiny. And the second the beam hit it, Victoria's blood turned to ice water. The thing inside the boy's ear moved. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a shadow. It was real. And in that moment, the Hart mansion changed, irrevocably. Victoria wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a conspirator. Over the next 2 weeks, a silent insurgency grew within those walls. Victoria and Shea built a language that didn't require sound. It was built on small rebellions. She would leave a gold-foiled chocolate coin under his pillow. He would leave a crudely drawn sketch of a P-51 Mustang on her cleaning cart. They created their own sign language, bypassing the rigid, formal ASL. His tutors tried to force on him. Tap on the chest meant happy. Pointing to the ceiling meant stars. And pressing both palms together, fingers interlocked, meant safe. When Shea started using that last sign, looking at Victoria with big dark eyes and pressing his palms together, it broke her heart. Because it was the first time in 8 years the boy had felt safe in his own home. But in a house this quiet, secrets are loud. It happened on a Tuesday evening. Victoria was in the industrial kitchen, scrubbing a copper pot, when the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She turned around. Mrs. Higgins was standing in the doorway. She didn't look angry. She looked like a boa constrictor. That had already decided how to swallow its prey. "I've seen you," Higgins said, her voice low, smooth, dangerous. Victoria gripped the sponge. "Ma'am?" With the boy, the candy, the little notes. Higgins stepped closer, her heels clicking on the tile like gunshots. "Mr. Hart pays you to scrub floors, Miss Dear. He does not pay you to play mother." "He's lonely," Victoria said, her voice trembling, but defiant. "He's just a kid." "He is a liability," Taijian snapped, "and so are you." The last girl who tried to fix him was escorted off the property by security. She didn't get a severance package. She didn't get a reference. She got a black mark that ensured she'd never work in a high-end home in this state again. Higgins leaned in, invading Victoria's personal space. "You have bills to pay, Victoria. Nursing home bills. If you want to keep your grandmother in a warm bed, you will stop this immediately. Do you understand?" Victoria looked down. "Yes, ma'am. Good. Back to work." That night, Victoria sat on the edge of her twin bed in the servants' quarters, staring at peeling paint on the wall. The threat worked. The math was simple. Interfere, and Grandma ends up in a state ward, medicated, forgotten. Stay silent, and Shea suffers. She opened her Bible to the Psalms, looking for an answer, but the pages were silent. All she could hear was the wind rattling the window pane and the echo of Higgins' voice. "You can't fix what's broken, but what if everyone was wrong? What if the boy wasn't broken?" The answer came the next morning, not from a burning bush, but from a stifled scream. Victoria was sweeping the East Wing corridor when she heard a dull thud from the garden terrace. It wasn't loud. Nothing in the Hart house was allowed to be loud, but it was heavy. She dropped her broom and ran to the French doors. Shea was sitting on a stone bench near the rose bushes, doubled over, forehead pressed against his knees, hands clamped tight over his right ear. He was screaming. Victoria could see it, his chest heaving, his mouth stretched wide, in a rictus of pure agony, the veins in his neck bulging. But there was no sound, just the terrifying silence of a child suffering alone. Victoria didn't care about the cameras. She didn't care about Mrs. Higgins or the bills. She burst through the doors, slid across the stone patio, skidding to a halt, on her knees, in front of him. "Shea, look at me." He didn't move. He rocked back and forth, tears streaming down his face, soaking his collar. Victoria gently grabbed his wrists. "Let go, baby. Let me see." He fought her at first, blind with pain. But when his eyes focused and he saw it was her, his safe person, he collapsed against her shoulder, sobbing, silently. Victoria's hands were shaking as she pulled his hair back. The morning sun was bright, cutting through the gloom of the estate. She tilted his head to the side, angling his ear directly into the beam of light. "I'm going to look," she signed, her movements shaky. "I promise, I won't hurt you." Shea squeezed his eyes shut and nodded. Victoria leaned in, held her breath, The sunlight illuminated the ear canal perfectly, better than her penlight ever could. And there it was, deep inside, lodged against the eardrum, a mass, black, dense, glistening, like wet obsidian. It wasn't wax. It wasn't an infection. It was a solid object, impacted so deep, the skin around it was angry and swollen. A memory hit Victoria, like a freight train. Her cousin Marcus, back in Newark, deaf in one ear, for 6 years. The doctors said it was nerve damage. Then a street clinic nurse took one look and pulled out a bead-sized rock he'd shoved in there as a toddler. The skin had grown over it. That's why the doctors missed it, because they were looking for complex diseases. Her heart hammering against her ribs as the truth formed. They were looking for genetic defects. They never thought to look for a piece of gravel. Victoria pulled back, eyes wide. She signed fast. Shea, there is something in your ear, a rock or a seed. We have to get it out. She started to stand. I'm going to tell your father. We need to go to the ER. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. Shea grabbed her wrist with a strength that shocked her. He shook his head frantically, eyes wide with panic. No, he signed, jerky, desperate, no father, no doctor. Shea, listen to me. They hurt, he signed, tears flying as his hands moved, always pain, never help. No, he was terrified. 8 years of cold exam rooms, needles, and disappointed stares had taught him one thing. Doctors bring pain, not relief. If she told Oliver, he'd call the same high-priced specialists who had failed for a decade. They would sedate Shea, and they might push the object deeper. Victoria looked at the boy, trembling in her arms. Then she looked at the garden shears, sitting on the bench beside them. Then back to the house. And the truth landed with a sinking weight. She was the only person in the world who knew what was inside his ear, and she was the only one who could end it. She grabbed Shea's shoulders, looked him dead in the eye. Do you trust me? She signed. Shea sniffled, wiped his nose on his sleeve. He looked at her, then slowly brought his palms together. Safe. Victoria took a deep breath. The air tasted like rain and copper. She knew what she was about to do was illegal. It was dangerous. If she slipped, she could puncture his eardrum and deafen him permanently. If she got caught, she would go to jail. Okay, she whispered, a steely resolve settling over her. We're not going to the doctor. She stood up and pulled him by the hand toward the servants' entrance. We're going to my room. But the courage she found in the garden didn't last. Once she fully understood the risk, fear took over. 3 days. That's how long Victoria lived, in purgatory. She couldn't eat. The staff meals in the kitchen, usually her one comfort, tasted like sawdust. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the image was there, that black, glistening obstruction, lodged deep in a little boy's skull. And then another image, heavy steel doors of a state penitentiary, slamming shut behind her. Because that's what happens when a maid performs unlicensed surgery on a billionaire's son. You don't get fired, you get arrested. On the 3rd night, insomnia was winning. Victoria sat on the edge of her mattress, her Bible open on her lap, but the words were swimming. All she could see was the face of her brother, Daniel. He died at 14, not from a car crash, not from a bullet, from poverty. He'd complained of chest pains for months, but they had no insurance, no connections. No voice. By the time they got him to the ER, his lungs were full of fluid. He drowned in his own body. While Victoria held his hand, screaming for a doctor who came 5 minutes too late. That night, she made a promise to God, over the sound of a flatlining monitor, never again. If I see suffering, I stop it. Victoria stood, walked to the narrow window of her room. The Connecticut moon was bright and cold, illuminating the vast, silent gardens of the Hart estate. I'm nobody, Lord. She whispered to the glass. I scrub toilets. I don't have a medical degree. If I'm wrong, I destroy my life. If I'm wrong, my grandmother dies alone, in a state ward. The room was heavy, with silence. Then a thought cut through the fear. Sharp, clear. Something her grandmother used to say. When the electricity got cut off in Newark, the Lord doesn't call the equipped baby girl. He equips the called. Victoria wiped a tear from her cheek. Her hand stopped shaking. The decision settled in her chest, like a stone hitting the bottom of a well. Okay, she breathed. Okay, if he suffers again, I act. And God help me if I miss. The moment came, 24 hours later. Thursday evening, the house was a tomb. Oliver Hart was in Manhattan for a gala, probably drinking 20-year-old scotch and shaking hands with senators. The staff was downstairs, prepping for the weekend. Victoria was in the upstairs gallery, folding a stack of Egyptian cotton towels when she heard it. Thump. Not the sound of a toy dropping. The heavy, sickening sound of a body hitting the floor. Victoria didn't think. She dropped the linens and sprinted down the hall. Shea was lying near the grandfather clock, curled into a fetal ball, knees pulled to his chest, hands clamped over his right ear, so hard his knuckles were white. He was writhing. This wasn't just discomfort. This was agony. The pressure inside his ear had reached a breaking point. Victoria slid across the polished floor and fell to her knees beside him. "I'm here, baby. I'm here." She pulled him into her lap, his face soaked with sweat and tears. He looked up at her, eyes wild with panic, silently begging for it to stop. Victoria reached into her apron pocket, her fingers closed around cold steel, tweezers. She'd stolen them from the first aid kit 3 days ago, boiled them in the kitchen when the cook wasn't looking, wrapped them in a clean napkin. She was ready. "Shea," she said, locking eyes with him. She signed with one hand, deliberate. "Trust. I fix. Now." The boy froze. He looked at the tweezers, then at Victoria. The terror was still there, but so was the exhaustion. He was tired of the pain. He gave a tiny nod, almost imperceptible. Victoria took a breath that felt like inhaling glass. "Guide my hands. Don't let me slip." She tilted his head toward the wall sconce. Light flooded the ear canal. The mass was there, angry, swollen, pushing against delicate skin. She inserted the tweezers. Her hand was rock steady now. Adrenaline burned away the fear, leaving only focus. She felt the steel tips touch the object. Hard. Stuck. She clamped down. Shea whimpered, his body tensing like a bowstring. "Hold still," she whispered, sweat beading on her forehead. Almost there. She pulled. Resistance. Like pulling a root out of dry earth. The skin inside the canal was holding on, fused to the object by years of neglect. Victoria gritted her teeth and gave one final steady tug. Pop. Something gave way. A rush of dark fluid followed, and the object slid free. It landed in Victoria's palm. She stared at it, in horror. It wasn't a rock. It was a hardened, calcified mass of organic matter. A seed, maybe, or a piece of food from when he was a toddler, encased in layers of wax and dried blood, the size of a marble. For a second, the only sound was Victoria's ragged breathing. Then Shea gasped, not a silent gasp, a sharp, audible intake of air, hissing through his teeth. His hands flew to his ears. His eyes popped open, wider than saucer plates. He sat up, scrambling away from her, looking around the hallway, frantic. He wasn't looking at Victoria, he was looking at the air. Tock, tock, tock. He pointed a trembling finger at the grandfather clock. The clock he'd walked past 1,000 times and never known existed. His mouth opened. His vocal cords, unused and rusty, struggled to form the shape. "Tick," he whispered. Rough, guttural, undeniable. "Tick." Victoria covered her mouth, tears exploding from her eyes. "Yes," she sobbed. "Yes, baby. That's the clock. You hear it? You hear it?" Shea grabbed his own throat, felt the vibration, and a look of pure wonder broke across his face. A sunrise after an 8-year night. He looked at Victoria, took a shaky breath. His lips moving, trying to remember the shape of a word he'd seen on lips but never heard. He swallowed, pushed the air out. "Dad." Victoria lunged forward and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his neck, sobbing uncontrollably. "Thank you, God. Thank you." Shea clung to her, shaking, overwhelmed by the rush of new sensations, the rustle of her uniform, the sound of his own crying, the hum of the house, and then a new sound. Heavy, fast, angry footsteps, thundering down the corridor. Victoria froze. The blood drained from her face. She looked up. Oliver Hart stood at the top of the stairs. He wasn't in Manhattan. He was here. And he looked like a man who'd just walked into a crime scene. His face was ashen, his eyes wide, darting from the blood on the floor to the tweezers in Victoria's hand to his son, shaking in the maid's arms. "Get away from him!" Oliver roared. Oliver's voice wasn't just loud. It was tectonic. It shook the hallway walls and rattled the crystal in the cabinet downstairs. He charged forward, like a linebacker, shoved Victoria hard enough to send her sprawling against the baseboard. Then he grabbed Shea by the shoulders, desperate, protective. "What did she do to you?" Oliver shouted, scanning his son for injuries, his eyes wild. "Did she hurt you?" Shea flinched. The sound of his father's voice was a physical assault on his raw, newly awakened eardrum, sharp, overwhelming, terrifyingly loud. But it was also beautiful. The boy opened his mouth. His tongue felt thick, clumsy. "Dad," Shea rasped. "I can hear you." Oliver froze. His hands, still gripping Shea's shoulders, went rigid. The hallway seemed to tilt on its axis. "What?" Oliver whispered, the word barely escaping his lips. Shea reached up, small trembling fingers tracing the stubble on his father's jawline. He looked at Oliver with pure awe. "Your voice," Shea whispered, the S sound hissing through his teeth. "Is that your voice?" Oliver's legs gave out. He sank to his knees, staring at his son, like he was seeing a ghost. For 8 years, he had prayed for this moment. He had paid $10 million for this moment, and now it was happening. On the hallway floor, next to a pile of dirty laundry. But then, his eyes snapped to Victoria. He saw the blood on her hands. He saw the steel tweezers catching the light, and he saw the dark, grotesque mass resting in her palm. Panic hijacked his brain. She cut him. She mutilated him. "Security!" Oliver bellowed, the sound tearing through the house. "Security!" 2 private guards materialized from the stairwell in seconds, hands on their holsters. "Get her away from my son!" Oliver snarled, pointing a shaking finger at Victoria. "Get her out!" "Sir, please!" Victoria scrambled to her feet, holding out her hand. "I didn't hurt him. I helped him. Look." She thrust her palm forward, displaying the calcified object. "This was inside his ear. This is why he couldn't hear. I just took it out." "You're not a doctor," Oliver roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "You're a maid. You could have pierced his brain. You could have killed him." Yet the guards grabbed Victoria, wrenching her arms behind her back. The handcuffs clicked, cold, tight, final. "No!" The scream didn't come from Victoria. It came from Shea, a guttural, jagged scream ripping through his throat. He lunged for Victoria, grabbing her apron. "No! Don't take! She helped! Dad, no!" The sound of his son's voice, loud, desperate, undeniably real, hit Oliver like a physical blow. He stopped cold, but the fear ran too deep, the programming too strong. Maids don't perform miracles. Doctors do. "Take her to the holding room," Oliver ordered, his voice trembling. "Call the Greenwich PD. I want her charged with assault." Victoria didn't fight. She didn't beg. As the guards dragged her backward, her eyes locked onto Shea. "It's okay, baby," she mouthed, tears streaming down her face. "You're going to be okay. Listen to the world. Just listen." The last thing she heard before the heavy oak door slammed shut was Shea sobbing. Loud, messy, beautiful sobs. The first sounds of grief he had ever made. 1 hour later, Greenwich Hospital was in chaos. Oliver paced the VIP corridor like a caged tiger. Inside exam room number 1, a team of 3 specialists swarmed over Shea. Scans, scopes, hearing tests. The machinery beeped and whirred. Sounds Oliver usually hated. But now, he strained to hear. If Shea was reacting, he was. Every beep made the boy flinch. A nurse stepped out, her face pale. "Mr. Hart? Dr. Matthews needs to see you in his office. Now." Oliver didn't walk. He marched. He burst into the office, ready to sue someone, ready to demand answers. Dr. Matthews, chief of audiology, sat behind a mahogany desk. He looked sick. "Mr. Hart," Matthews said, not meeting Oliver's eyes. "Please, sit down." "Just tell me," Oliver snapped, remaining standing. "Did she damage his ear? Is he permanently deaf?" "No," Matthews said quietly. "His hearing is remarkably intact. The eardrum is scarred but functional. The obstruction acted like a plug. It preserved the inner ear perfectly." Oliver let out a breath. He didn't know he was holding. Thank God. The police are on their way to pick up the woman who put it there. Matthews flinched. He reached for a manila folder on his desk. His hand was shaking. "Mr. Hart, the obstruction wasn't put there by the maid, and it wasn't recent." He slid the folder across the glass surface. "This is Shea's scan from 3 years ago, from the clinic in Zurich." Oliver flipped the folder open, a dense MRI image of a skull, and there, circled in bright red marker, a note in the margin. "Dense obstruction noted in right canal, non-vascular. Recommend immediate removal." Oliver stared at the words. The room started to spin. Someone saw this. 3 years ago? "It appears so," Matthews said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But look at the billing code below it." Oliver looked. Patient status, chronic. Protocol, long-term management. "Long-term management," Oliver repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Mr. Hart," Matthews said, "removing that blockage takes 10 minutes and costs about $200. Managing a congenital deafness case for a billionaire's son generates millions in consultations, therapies, and devices over a lifetime. The realization hit Oliver like a freight train. They knew, the experts, the Ivy League doctors, the specialists he flew around the world. They had seen the blockage and left it there because curing his son was bad for business, because his desperation was their retirement fund. They kept my son deaf, Oliver whispered, his voice breaking, on purpose. Matthews didn't answer. He didn't have to. Oliver stood up. He felt nauseous. He felt rage so pure. It blinded him. "Where are you going?" Matthews asked. "I have to stop the police," Oliver said, turning to the door. "And I have to beg forgiveness from the only person who actually gave a damn." Victoria sat alone in the security holding room of the Hart estate. The handcuffs were still on, biting into her wrists. She wasn't praying for herself. She wasn't thinking about jail time or nursing home bills. She was praying for Shea. "Let the hearing hold, Lord. Let him hear the birds. Let him hear music. Let him be okay." The lock clicked. Victoria stiffened, expecting the police, expecting rights being read. The door swung open. Oliver Hart stood there. But he wasn't the titan of industry who threw her against the wall an hour ago. He was unraveled, tie loose, eyes red-rimmed. A man who looked hollowed out. "Victoria," he said. He spoke her name like it was a prayer. She stood up, her knees shaking. "Mr. Hart, I can explain." "I swear, I don't," he said, walking into the room. "Don't explain. Don't apologize. Don't say a single word." He stopped in front of her. He looked at the handcuffs on her wrists, reached into his pocket for the key the guards had given him. His hands trembled as he unlocked them. The metal clattered to the floor. And then, Oliver Hart, the billionaire, the man who commanded armies of lawyers, did the unthinkable. He dropped to his knees on the concrete floor. He bowed his head, grasped her hand in his, and he wept. "I'm sorry," he choked out, tears dripping onto her uniform. "I am so sorry." Victoria stared down at him, stunned. "Mr. Hart, the doctors knew," Oliver sobbed, looking up at her, his face a mask of anguish. "They saw the blockage years ago. They left it there. They let my boy suffer because I was paying them too much to cure him." He squeezed her hand, desperate. "I trusted the credentials. I trusted the suits. I threw millions at the problem. And I never once," he swallowed hard, "I never once just looked at him." A jagged breath. "You were the only one who looked. You were the only one who saw him." Oliver stood up slowly, wiped his face, and his eyes hardened with a new resolve. "Victoria, whatever you want, whatever you need, name it. It's yours." Victoria rubbed her wrists. She looked at this broken, powerful man. She didn't want his money. She didn't want his power. "I don't want anything, Mr. Hart," she said softly. "I just want to know. Can I say goodbye to him before I go?" Oliver shook his head. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "In fact, I have a feeling you're about to become the most important person in this entire company." He opened the door. "But first," he said, "there's someone in the car, Ma, who has a lot of questions, and I think he wants to hear your answer." As they walked to the car, Oliver's voice trembled, a mixture of shame and gratitude. "You saw him," he whispered. "I looked at scans. I looked at invoices. I looked at quarterly reports. But you actually saw him." Victoria looked down at the billionaire, the anger she'd felt, the fear of the police, the terror of losing her grandmother, evaporated. All she saw was a father, conned by the people he trusted most. "I didn't do anything special, Mr. Hart," she said softly, her thumb brushing his knuckles. "I just loved him. That's all." Oliver shook his head. He looked older than he had that morning, but his eyes were clearer. "No," he said, "that's everything. I spent 8 years and $10 million trying to buy a miracle. I flew to Tokyo, to Zurich, to London, and God sent the answer through the woman I hired to scrub my floors for minimum wage." Victoria wiped a stray tear from her cheek. "My grandmother always says, God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called." Oliver straightened his tie, a flash of the CEO, returning to his posture. "Well," he said, "your grandmother is a wise woman. And as of this moment, her nursing home bills are no longer your concern. I'm buying the facility. She'll have the presidential suite." He opened the door. "Now, let's go. There's a boy waiting for us." The drive to Greenwich Hospital was a blur of silence, but not the heavy silence that haunted the Hart estate. This was different, the silence of anticipation. When they reached the VIP wing, the hallway was buzzing, nurses whispering, glancing at the door. To room 304. Oliver didn't stop for updates. He pushed the door open. Shea was sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing oversized, noise-canceling headphones connected to a tablet. He wasn't looking at a screen. He was looking at the air. He was swaying. Oliver stopped in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. Shea was listening to Mozart's Requiem, complex, layering violins, flooding into a brain, starved of sound since birth. The boy's face, a landscape of pure wonder, eyes wide, darting left and right, as if he could see the notes floating in the room. Then he saw Victoria. He didn't hesitate. He ripped the headphones off and scrambled off the high hospital bed, bare feet slapping against the linoleum. Slap, 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 a sound he could finally hear. He ran straight to her. Victoria! The name came out rough, like gravel grinding together, unpolished, raw. But to Victoria, it was the most beautiful symphony ever composed. He wrapped his arms around her waist, buried his face in her apron. "Thank you," he rasped, the words vibrating against her ribs. "Thank you." Victoria dropped to her knees, hugging him so tight she feared she might break him. "You were always worth hearing, baby," she whispered into his hair. "Always." Shea pulled back. He looked at his father. Oliver stood by the door, tears streaming down his face, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. Shea walked over to him. He didn't sign. He didn't flinch. He reached out and placed his small hand flat against the center of Oliver's chest, right over the sternum. He closed his eyes, tilting his head. "Dad?" Shea whispered, his eyes snapping open. Boom, boom. Boom, boom. He looked up, a smile breaking across his face, lighting up the sterile room. "I can hear your heart." Oliver Hart crumbled. He dropped to the floor, pulling his son into his chest, rocking him back and forth. For the first time in 8 years, the mansion's silence was truly broken, not by a scream, but by the sound of a father and son crying together. Victoria stood by the window, watching the sun set over the Connecticut skyline. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with sterile hospital air. It tasted like victory. God had answered her prayer, not with a check, not with a credentialed expert, but with a pair of tweezers and a willing heart. But as she watched the reunion, she noticed something shift in Oliver's eyes. He kissed the top of Shea's head, whispered, "I love you," then slowly stood up. He walked to the window, standing next to Victoria. He wasn't crying anymore. The grief was gone, and in its place was something cold, hard, terrifyingly sharp. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialed a number. Victoria didn't recognize. "It's Hart," Oliver said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. That made the hair on Victoria's arms stand up. "I want the legal team assembled in 1 hour. Not the corporate lawyers, the sharks." He paused, watching his son playing with the headphones. "I want the names of every specialist, every clinic, and every hospital administrator who touched my son's file in the last 8 years. I want their licenses. I want their practices. And then I want their freedom." He turned to Victoria, and for the first time, she saw the true face of the billionaire. Not the face of a victim, the face of a man going to war. "Burn them," Oliver whispered into the phone. "Burn them all, to the ground."